Morning, everybody. Morning, friends from Mauritius and also all of Africa and the rest of the world. I know a lot of you tune in from even UK and Europe as well. Great for you to be here. Morning, Wayne, out of Cape Town.
Morning, Kevin. Thanks very much.
How are you doing, my friend?
All good. We're still sort of in semi-lockdown, but we're surviving, and it's yeah.
So we're still alive then. So we're surviving. Absolutely. That reminds me the song of Bee Gees, staying alive. Yeah. I would hope it's beautiful weather in Cape Town, or
actually today's a beautiful day. We're supposed to have a bit of a cold front coming through on Wednesday or Thursday, but today's beautiful.
Great. Wayne, I've known you for, gosh, I'm thinking more than 12 years or 13 years. I think at the time we met around 2007 or 6, you were at the verge of setting up your consulting firm, HDI. You are the founder, CEO of HDI Consulting. I've known you, I've seen you, how you've grown your company in Africa from a consulting perspective, but also from a transaction perspective as well. You're one of the leading advisors in hospitality in Africa. You've done so many deals across the continent, all over the continent, actually, including Mauritius. So, Wayne, I think you're going to be talking about something specific today about brand evolution. Obviously, when we talk about brands, we talk about international brands, regional brands, local brands, etc. I would love for you to take us through your presentation. And give us a perspective of what you've seen over the last 10 years, and then also what you believe is going to happen in the near and medium-term future. Wayne, it's all yours, and the questions is going to come afterwards. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks very much. Yeah, I thought it might be different to change the theme a little bit. Everybody's talking about COVID all the time, and in terms of what the impact is of COVID. I am focusing a little bit on that, but it's with a different angle, not really in terms of performance and stats, but more around, what's happened to the brands over the last 15 years and what has started to happen now and what's likely to happen from an operator perspective. So diving into my presentation, I'll just give you guys a brief overview of who HDI Consulting is, not too much, and then looking at the historic brand landscape up until 2005, and then looking from 2005 to 2020, what's really, what the growth has been in terms of the international brands or international operators, and then also what the regional operators have grown and what's come out of the continent. And then looking at what the current impacts have been and what's been happening recently in the news in terms of shake-ups from brandings and debranding, etc., and then just into a Q&A. So from an HDI Consulting perspective, as Kevin mentioned, HDI Consulting has been in operation actually since 2003, so 17 years. We full-service hospitality advisory. We have offices in Cape Town and in Mauritius. We have 4 people in Mauritius and 6 in Cape Town, or 5 now actually in Cape Town. And over the last 17 years, we've worked in 450 assignments in 45 countries. It's covering full advisory as well as brokerage. So this is just in terms of the map of where we've worked, and we focus a lot on market and financial feasibility studies, a lot of due diligence for banks, valuations of hotel assets, operator selection. In the last 3 years, we've actually signed 17 management contracts for all the major operators on the continent, so we understand them intimately. And we've also done debt finance raising, one of the most, and brokerage, and the largest transaction we did was the 4 Points Sheraton Lagos last year or the year before. These are just some of the projects that we worked on. I won't go into too much detail, but some of the iconic ones that we've we help try and get clients over the line. So the Pullman is under construction in Accra. Some significant ones would be the Imavan in Swaziland, the first Hilton, or wasn't actually the first Hilton Garden Inn in Africa, but first in Southern Africa. We also iconically did the first Radisson Red in Africa, the feasibility study and the operator selection, and also the first AC by Marriott in South Africa and in Africa, and the first 2 Marriotts. One just opened in Melrose Arch, the first 2 Marriotts in Southern Africa. So without too much about us, if we dive into looking at the historic brand landscape, these are, at the time, if we look at the major international brands, the only ones that were present pre sort of 2005 were Accor, Starwood, IHG, and Hilton. And these are what we call kind of the legacy brands in Africa. A lot of these deals were done in the 60s and 70s, mainly with governments, where you see, historically Sheratons, Hiltons, Intercontinentals, and some of the Accor products. And the brands lay dormant for a long period, and they didn't really come into Africa until some of them after 2005. So some entered a little bit earlier, but there wasn't much activity up until 2005. We jumped to 2010. We started seeing on about 16 operators. These are all the major ones we're talking about. There are a lot. There's probably a lot more that we haven't covered. So if we haven't covered everybody, apologies for that. So it's not intentional. But looking at the international brands, we've got Accor, Hyatt entered in. It wasn't from 2005. Residor was probably the first to and most aggressive in terms of targeting Africa from the early 2000s, and grew the most significantly up to 2010 out of all the brands. Kempinski entered the market, and so did Movenpick. So looking at that, the brands started entering mainly with their core brands and up to 2010. And then really things have started to take off from 2010 to 2020. So in 2010, just jumping back, we had on about 16 operators, of which probably 6 or 7 are major international brands. And this has increased to around about 36 operators, both international brands and regional brands, total around about 826 branded hotels. The most dominant brand is currently Protea Hotels by Marriott. We'll go into that a little bit more. Looking at the international operators in 2020, there's been a lot more that have obviously entered and seen the opportunities and potential in Africa. Some of the leisure brands, there's probably a little bit more that we haven't included, but Four Seasons have come to the market. Hyatt have also come in post 20, and Kempinski as well post 2010. And then looking at the regional brands, we've seen, some of these have been homegrown African regional brands, the likes of Serena, which is out of the Aga Khan Foundation, Azalai, mainly in West Africa, Mangalis, also mainly for now in West Africa, but focusing on 4 brands. Anomo have grown significantly, focusing more on the mid-market segment. Currently, I think around about 13 hotels. And then also some of the other Bond Hotels also grew out of, the founder of Protea Hotels, his son started Bond Hotels. They've grown their presence quite significantly in Nigeria and in other markets. AHA is owned by Tourvest. And then we also started seeing a lot of the kind of regional brands from other markets, the Far East, Dubai. So from Dubai and from the Middle East perspective, we've got Ratana and Dusit, Saravar from India, Mina from Thailand, Ascot more from the Far East, and then others like Milia from Spain. So if we sort of dissect that a little bit more and having a look at these top international operators, I think this slide's quite interesting, because if you look at the number of hotels, you're looking at Accor and Marriott that actually have the most number of hotels in Africa. you need to, if you compare Accor and Marriott to Hilton, RSG, and IHG, the strategies have been very different to how they've got to where they are from an Africa perspective. Accor have acquired, both Accor and Marriott have done it mainly the acquisition route. Accor have acquired Movenpick, a stake in 25 Hours. They've also bought Fairmont, Raffles, parts of Banyan Tree. So they've done it on the acquisition route. And so as Marriott, from an Africa perspective, their most significant acquisition, well, they've made two major acquisitions which consolidated their brands, which was Starwood, which was most recently, and then also Protea Hotels out of South Africa. So that, basically took their hotels from no presence in 2005 and 2010 pretty much to 146 hotels. Hilton have grown pretty much organically through management contracts. Radisson have been the most aggressive and probably the first to enter the market, and have grown up to 44 hotels in 21 countries. IHG's growth, they've changed their strategy a bit over the years, but they've moved more towards the franchise model. And then regionally, the specific brands, obviously Sogo Sun, City Lodge, and then we're starting to see Bond Hotels with 15 hotels and Onoma with 13, and just outside of this list would be Mangalis. And it's quite interesting to see that those brands, being brands that have grown out of Africa, have grown quite significantly to their number of hotels. So those were the management companies we were focusing on. And now if we dive down into kind of brand presence, so specific hotel brands, Protea Hotels is the most dominant by Marriott. Then Southern Sun, with mainly South Africa, but also Southern Africa presence. And Radisson Blu, then the third brand. So, they've grown as a brand itself in terms of being was the first to enter. The brands, the big international brands typically started with their core brands, and then they moved towards, looking at other brands. So Ibis has a historic presence, but has also grown, and Hilton has grown quite significantly. So, and Mantis has now also been acquired by Accor. That's also helped in terms of their country, their representation as a company. So looking at what's kind of happened and what things, how this has been created, as I've touched on a little bit. The operators have rebranded a lot of independent properties, and I think they've shifted in the last 10 years from doing a lot of greenfield projects to brownfield projects. This is largely because I think one of the most significant risks in Africa is development risk. So, and also if they can plug the hotel in immediately, this is where a lot of their focus has been. And as new products and as Africa has evolved and better quality independently operated properties that come on stream, these are the kind of properties that the brands can rebrand. And some of them, like Hilton, have actually focused on this and created a fund to help them rebrand properties by creating a key money fund to facilitate that. So, and then also we've seen consolidation, as we mentioned, in terms of the acquisitions. International operators acquired smaller operators to grow faster, and also to create a presence and enter markets that they found very difficult to penetrate historically, especially markets like South Africa. Difficult to penetrate, so Marriott's acquisition sort of jumped them into the market significantly as a significant player. And then we've seen regional brands such as Onoma, Bond Hotels, and Mangalis starting to enter the market, offering more kind of flexible products, targeting smaller properties as well that the typical international brands don't look at. And then the international brands have also moved from sort of a hub and spoke strategy to a strategy where they started to look at more secondary markets and opening up secondary markets. And then the last point, the international operators have started looking at introducing new brands into the market, mid-scale and economy brands that they historically thought that wouldn't do well in Africa. and might have been too difficult and they needed more scalability before they would enter. We started to see a lot of these brands starting to enter the market that we haven't seen historically. So looking at what the impact of COVID might be in terms of on brand evolution going forward, be interesting to see which brands will have their finger on the button. I think going forward, we're going to start seeing a shake-up in the market. We already have started seeing some in terms of, you know, the brand landscape and the operator landscape. I think we will see some portfolio acquisitions of some smaller portfolios come under strain during this period. I think coming out of COVID, we're going to see value-driven brands having more growth potential, lifestyle brands, select service brands, and apartment hotel brands, which might focus more on the longer stay, might need to be cleaned less, less contact with guests. I think we'll start seeing some of that coming through. The brands will also start leaning more towards conversions, and they're starting to adapt their procedures, and you might even see some new brands coming out that might focus on this opportunity to, you know, for them to enter the market on a short-term basis and be more flexible in terms of conversions and property improvement programs and not requiring too much in terms of brand standards. And then you'll start seeing consolidations, I think. I think everybody's going to look internally at their businesses and decide on whether, you know, whether it's actually the profitability is actually worth it from an Africa perspective. I think we're going to see some debrandings, some change in branding. I think we might see some brands actually not be focused aggressively. Some of the brands might scale down their efforts a little bit. I think everybody's going to look internally. And then we're definitely going to start seeing some asset sales and distressed assets coming onto the market, which we'll look at, which will facilitate also rebranding in some instances and other opportunities. We've already started to see some stuff, and this is some of the news that's in the market. The most recently is the Marriott who pulled out of 3 hotels in South Africa, and so Sun have taken them over because they're the owners of the properties. And we also seen the Oli Sereni and the Dusit D2 in Kenya has closed indefinitely, and it's probably going to be redeveloped into offices. The Shadri Group have bought some iconic Fairmont properties in Kenya, and those will more than likely be rebranded as their Zinc brand. And then most recently, well, not recently, the Mayfair Hotel has closed, or not sure what's happening in terms of that, and whether that'll be rebranded. Southern Sun no longer is going to operate that. And from a capital perspective, Casada Capital looking at expanding, and obviously they're linked to Accor, so we'll probably see more transactions coming from them. Not to focus too much on this, because I think I'm kind of out of time, but it'll be interesting to see what's going to happen. I'm sure you've seen a lot of stats on COVID, but this is quite an interesting one just to show in terms of that we think that the market, and some of this is from STR, that STR Global, that we'll look at the recovery, probably only full recovery 2022 or up to starting in 2023. But depending on the different recovery scenarios, we'll see leisure recovery first, domestic leisure, followed probably by corporate domestic, and then looking at international, and lastly probably conference growth. We also probably see the mid-scale and economy hotels, or mid-scale and economic hotels, have recovered at a quicker rate already. And as mentioned, the full recovery is probably only started, will be end of 2022 to 2023. So I think that brings my formal presentation to a close. And now I'm happy to take questions from Kevin.
Great, thanks Wayne. Great opportunity for us to see how the brands have evolved. I mean, you've mentioned, you know, 3 sort of eras, basically 2005, 2010, and 2020. Clearly far more international operators in Africa than when you started back in 2003, and when I got to know you in 2006, I guess. I've got quite a lot of questions about, I think we're going to try to cover a number of questions around Africa. And then also I've got a couple of questions for you specifically around Mauritius as well. It's a market that you know extremely well. Yeah. If you look at Africa, I mean, you've talked about where we are today. You've talked about international brands, but also regional, local brands, African brands. Yeah, you've mentioned the likes of Onomo, Mangalis. There were other brands as well, like Cresta, and then obviously your usual South African brands as well, like City Lodge, etc. Do you see regional brands? Because typically regional brands came up in specific regions, West Africa, Francophone, or East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, etc., or even sort of, you know, West Africa, Anglophone, Ghana, Nigeria. Do you see, you've talked about consolidation, you've mentioned consolidation. Do you see consolidation of regional brands, regional African brands? Is that something which is possible, is being talked about, or not
No,
yet?
I think it's actually probably the opposite. I think some of those regional brands that started, some of them with their roots in West Africa, Onomo is a classic example, have already expanded to other parts of Southern Africa. Onomo acquired hotel recently in Tanzania. They did the acquisition in South Africa, the development in South Africa. They're now opening in East Africa, in Tanzania, in Kampala, and they're already open in Kigali. So they've started expanding into other parts of Africa. Azalai have expressed interest in expanding to other parts of Africa, starting also carrying on in West Africa, but more in the Anglophone West Africa, where they historically were in Francophone. And then we're starting to see others that would be expanding. Mangalis is a classic example that they are starting to look. And I think Onomo will also start looking at management contracts. Historically, they're owner-operated. They will start looking at I would think, at management contracts. And Mangalis also expanded into the management contract. So I think some of those brands have started off as owner-operators as well as Azalai. And I think they're all going to start looking at maybe franchising or management contracts because it would be able to accelerate their growth.
And do you see, interesting, I mean, but do you see, obviously, when you look at the international operators, they pretty much on asset-light strategy. The likes of Mangalis started with their own hotels and brick and mortar, and then also talking about asset-light strategy. Why would somebody choose a regional African brand as opposed to an international brand? What are the key differentiating factors?
I think it's a very good question. I think one is flexibility. Their brand standards are not as strict. They also typically would look at smaller properties. The brands typically only look at 150 keys plus, whereas the regional brands would look at something smaller. I think they also have a good understanding of the landscape in terms of the markets. And if you look at the travelers, there's a lot of regional travelers, and that brand recognition resonates quite heavily with them. And I think also their contracts are typically more flexible. So it just depends on, and you're probably going to get a more personalized service because they don't have as many properties and they more focused on growing. And I think that they're more, negative brand impact can hit them a lot harder than it would an international brand. So I think all those factors focus on, and we've seen with the international brands where what they sort of counteracting to compete with that is being more flexible in terms of more franchise contracts. So, and those franchise contracts, they can go down to 100 rooms, whereas their managed contracts will be 150.
And talking about franchise contracts, the big international operators, typically they normally look for management agreements. Are you seeing any change in terms of going franchise?
Yeah, there's been a very big change. I think the most significant one's probably Hilton. Hilton have, I wouldn't say it's been a change. They've always looked at franchises, but as they aggressively now, have a strategy and a focus at even, contributing towards key money towards franchises, and I think they're seeing those as the opportunities. And so I think some of them, quite a significant proportion of their deals that they've done in the last 2-3 years have been franchise deals. We're seeing IHG obviously have moved completely or pretty much to a franchise model because they don't have a strong presence themselves in Africa. They operate mainly out of the Far East or out of Dubai. And so they typically, they would only look at really big properties if they manage them 300 keys plus. Radisson haven't looked at the franchises yet, but I believe, with their new owners, I wouldn't be surprised if they start looking at them shortly. I think it's a strategy they might look at. Obviously, I'm not speaking for them. Marriott have aggressively also started looking at franchise. So I think things have definitely changed in terms of that. I think it's also as the brands have learned that in Africa, things are not easy. And if you can take and development risk is the most significant risk. And there's hotels. The average time it's taken for a hotel to come to market is probably about 5 years, which is very long. If you can consider that in markets like Mauritius or in South Africa, more developed markets, and in Kenya, you can open a hotel in 2 years, 1.5, 2 years. So I think they're looking at that they can rather plug franchises on existing properties and use it as a way to grow faster. We've also started seeing, with that same strategy, what we call third-party management companies, the likes of Vala Hospitality, Aleph, who's Barney Haddad, who started it from ex-Wyndham. And these third-party management companies can manage franchised brands. So they're working together to grow the brands on the continent. And I think they're seeing that as a strategy, which is typically the US model that they can actually use in Africa as well.
So are you in that context, because I mean, it sounds like the landscape is changing, is evolving, is probably maturing as well. Are you seeing any pressure in terms of management fees? Are you seeing sort of competition sort of happening at that level, or how flexible, if any, of them are getting to in terms of skinning the management fees?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we published an article probably in 2005 or maybe a little bit later in terms of management contract negotiation, and we're going to publish one quite shortly as well, which gives an update on all the different changes that have been made. And we definitely have seen fee structures come down significantly. I mean, at that time, just one particular fee, the base fee was average then used to be around about 3%. And now we've seen base fees come down to an average of probably about 2.5%, with some base fees as low as 2%. So, and we've seen a lot more flexibility on incentive fees instead of, fixed fees by year, in terms of fixed percentages, to more flexible percentages based on performance. So yes, we have. I mean, we're going to continue to see it. I think, it'll probably, I don't know if the fees can go down any further, because you've also got to look at what the, minimum thresholds are for the hotel companies in terms of, fee thresholds. And I think we're getting close to those kind of levels, and that's why they're increasing from maybe 120 rooms to 150 rooms, and they'll probably even increase that further.
And Wayne, I mean, during this COVID period, I mean, we're not out of it. Obviously, we'll probably have to manage or live with it for quite a while. A lot of hotels around the world, but also Mauritius, but also Africa, more specifically Africa, are currently closed. You've negotiated so many management contracts over the years, on both sides. Yeah. Are there any clauses specifically to tackle COVID-19 period? Can an owner, for example, use this as an opportunity to cancel the contract or renegotiate the contract, or is that's not the case at all?
Yeah, that's a good point. I've actually been meaning to try and see whether we could have a webinar with a legal firm to actually get a legal opinion, but I don't know if anybody wants to voice that legal opinion. But in terms of one of the clauses is the force majeure clause, and I think some contracts have specified what force majeure is. Some of them stipulate a particular time that force majeure needs to continue for at least 3 months or 6 months. So it is important to have a look at what those clauses cover and whether, some explicitly might have covered pandemics and some might have excluded pandemics. So I do know some contracts have, specifically excluded pandemics. But I think we're going to definitely see a change in the contracts. The ones that didn't have pandemics written into them would definitely be written in now, and where the brands wouldn't necessarily allow a force majeure, or termination during that period. But I think
so you'll probably need a scientist to help you to define what a pandemic means, yeah, as opposed to just a legal person.
Yeah, sometimes there's a classification, or they'd have to classify that it, that a pandemic has started, from that perspective. But some do say that if it negatively impacts the business and the hotel has to close for 3 months or 6 months, then you can terminate the contract. So it differs by contract, and it depends on when you sign that contract by year, because obviously the brands adjust their contracts every single year. New clauses that come in to strengthen their case and also cover unforeseen circumstances that like this. So I think it is specific, but there will be some contracts that you can see allowing for termination during this period.
And your views about, again, sticking to Africa, your views about service apartments. I mean, we've seen globally how the brand, such as Airbnb, for example, in the informal sector, has really carved their way out, and created sort of great opportunities in many countries. What are your views? I mean, the international brands, or even the local African brands, when are they, or are they seriously looking at venturing into service apartments?
I think some of them have already looked at service apartments. I mean, I think there's a distinction between service apartments and what we call kind of apart hotels. An apart hotel is is run like a hotel, very much short stay. Rooms are smaller, doesn't necessarily have full kitchens. But then you get some service apartments that have full kitchens, much more longer stay kind of environment. And that's more what the Airbnb kind of market is. It's not really geared up towards very short stay, if you're staying for 2-3 days, things like that. But we're definitely seeing more. I mean, one of the markets that's actually one of the hotels that's recovering faster seems to be economy hotels, but also some of these apart hotels or service apartments. Partially, I think, because of the more limited contact with staff and from a cleaning perspective. But I think it's still wait to be seen in terms of that, in terms of how that's going to impact. But Airbnb has had a significant impact, but you've got to look at unpacking that as well, because a lot of the Airbnb hotels or apartments have already been in the markets under different channels. So it's not necessarily a growth in the actual number of rooms, but there has been. But you also got to unpack that, and a lot of these Airbnb products are only on the market for 2 to 3 months. So I think it is a competitor, but they don't have the full service capability that a hotel has. And I think it's going to be interesting during this time coming out of COVID on the trust factor, because the brands have made significant noises in terms of how they're going to sanitize rooms and how they're reacting to this. And I don't know if the sort of informal sector and individual Airbnb products will be able to combat that.
Sure.
We'll see, how much that plays in terms of choice of the consumer.
Sure, absolutely. And Wayne, I mean, most of the international brands currently operating in Africa, we've seen so many new hotels over the years. If you can, I don't know if you can move to that slide where you sort of showed the number of rooms, etc. That's the one, yeah, the number of keys, yep. So obviously, quite significant change from 10 years ago. I would assume most of these hotels are in primary cities and pretty much city hotels. When or what are you seeing, or, for example, in locations which are driven by beach resorts, for example, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Kenya, Mombasa, Mozambique, or even West Africa, Senegal, etc. Are you seeing international brands taking over resorts or positioning themselves in that segment, excluding Mauritius? Yeah, I'll come back to Mauritius afterwards. Yeah, but from an Africa perspective, yeah.
Absolutely. I think I didn't focus too much on the leisure, but I probably should have put a few more leisure brands in here that have come into the market. But I mean, we've definitely seen some of the recent acquisitions like TUI Blue, and they're on an aggressive drive. They're definitely looking at Mauritius, Seychelles. They've got a property, did an acquisition, and they have a property in Zanzibar, which they acquired last year. Milia is another one from a leisure perspective, which has in Zambia, in Zanzibar, and also looking at other markets. And then we're actually starting to see a proliferation of some of the Spanish groups, the likes of Bostelo, the likes of Catalonia Hotels, who are also on the acquisition trail, looking at acquisitions in markets like Mauritius, also in Zanzibar. And then we're starting to see, other destinations like Kenya in terms of Mombasa, Senegal, Club Med. So Club Med have obviously expanded into Senegal and also into Morocco. So, there has been a drive, and also into Cape Verde. So Cape Verde is a market that have got a lot of the brands that have entered and seeing potential, obviously the proximity to Europe. So there's been quite a significant shakeup in terms of the leisure sector as well. And it's actually been very recent. I mean, and literally in the last year or two, that we've seen, Spanish brands looking at new destinations like Mauritius, and also Zanzibar being kind of top on their list.
Great. So let's move to Mauritius. I mean, you just mentioned Mauritius. Yeah, I mean, it's a market which you know extremely well. Predominantly has been driven by local brands over the last 40 years or 50 years. Interestingly, I did a webinar with a well-known Mauritian guy who's been in hospitality for many years, and he basically said, the business model of Mauritius has been pretty much the same for 70 years. So can you imagine, with 2020, so we're talking 1950s, we started in the first year in Mauritius with 1,500-ish number of tourists back then in a whole year. But obviously that's evolved today. There are a couple of international brands in the market. I mean, Radisson, Meridian, Hilton, Angsana, et cetera, et cetera. The question I have for you, knowing the market so well, the big local Mauritian groups, I mean, you know all of them, the Beachcombers, the Sun Resorts, the Attitude, etc. They probably have around plus minus 40% of the rooms in Mauritius. Do you think there's value for them to partner with international brands, or not necessarily management, but maybe franchise? Could a group have multiple brands on, as opposed to one brand for all the hotels? What are your views?
Yeah, I mean, if I had to give any advice from that perspective, I think there's two things. We need to look at international brands that are the big ones like we've got on the left, which are basically not really leisure resort brands except for Club Med, but basically they cross the entire spectrum of all types of hotel, business hotels. Some of them have 20, 30 brands. They're not dedicated towards resort type destinations. And I honestly think that they're not as efficient as, as probably some of the Mauritian brands already are efficient in their market. And then other leisure focused brands, the likes of TUI Blue, linked with tour operators. I think, the strength is of those properties, that their relationships and what they've grown out of is that they are essentially tour operator brands, Barcelo, likes of Catalonia Hotels, TUI Blue, Iberostar, those type of brands that are going to bring extra distribution channels immediately to Mauritius. Whereas I think the international brands, some of them have tried to enter this market, you know, and just I don't think their systems and procedures and what they have actually gears them up towards that. You know, if you plug in a TUI, obviously you've got that whole engine behind you. So I would see that there should be some consolidation or some partnering, especially during this time, possibly with the likes of you know, these type of brands, because they have also been on the acquisition and expansion drive, but I think that they reluctant to now fork out huge amounts of money, seeing what the significant impact's been. So I think JVs and, you know, minority stakes, or even doing type of franchise models or management models where they can guarantee, you know, some of these management companies, these resort management companies have historically guaranteed certain occupancy percentages, etc. So I think that would be the best kind of solution and opportunity from a Mauritian perspective. I don't think that, I honestly don't believe that the international brands are as geared up from a leisure perspective. And I think if you look at what Mauritian companies have done over the last 7 years, it's quite similar to, you know, they've also tried to enter the South African market, and likes of Sogo Sun, etc. It's been a very difficult market for the international brands to penetrate, because they, you know, there's a lot of local understanding that that those brands don't necessarily have, and intricate understanding of the Mauritian market that the Mauritian brands have.
Speaking about South African brands, I've always asked, you know, why we haven't seen any South African brands going into Mauritius. You know, it's next door. There's a South African market. You know, 10% of the tourists from Mauritius comes from South Africa. You know, and South African tourism industry is very strong. I mean, you know, the pool of hotels that you've got here in South Africa are extremely well designed, well managed. You know, so any possibilities, Wayne?
Kevin, I don't think so. To be brutally honest, I think maybe in the business market, possibly, but I think they're going to be competing with the international brands in that market. The difficulty is that in South Africa, we haven't really had a strong leisure brand, and I think that's kind of missing, you know, in the sense that, you know, Sogo Sun obviously have some leisure properties. A lot of those actually have flipped from managed to timeshare. So, you know, they've actually probably found that it doesn't really work for them. They haven't taken on any new leisure properties in a while. So, and Sun International typically only had their hotels with casinos. So I think that's the difficulty. I mean, Club Med has done extremely well in Mauritius through the South African market. And I think there's opportunities definitely, you know, looking at kind of business models that work to attract the South Africans. But I don't see, I can't see the South African brands entering the market except on a business perspective. I think Sogo Sun probably would be the most likely, I think, to enter possibly with a business hotel.
Okay, great, Wayne. Listen, on that note, we've reached 40 minutes, 45 minutes. Obviously, I've got so many other questions. You know, I could spend another hour easily, at the minimum, you know, to talk about the future of the industry. You know, probably a couple of months from now, maybe, you know, you should come back again and tell us what you're seeing post lockdown, because a number of countries in Africa are still under lockdown. Nigeria, for example, is still sort of locked down. So, as an example, Mauritius has opened up domestically, but they're yet to open up the borders to other countries. You know, and South Africa seems to me that South Africa might be locked down until the end of the year. There's conflicting messages coming out of South Africa, but there's quite a bit of lobby to try to say South Africa should open up at least with a couple of countries. Hopefully they open up with Mauritius, for example, because it's an important market for Mauritius. Wayne, your final words, you know, what advice would you give to hotel owners these days? You know, brands, international, local, regional, valuable, not valuable. What are the top 3 tips would you be able to give as a freebie? Yeah.
Well, I think during this time, I think the key thing is resilience. I think you obviously need to look at structures that you can get you through this. And I think if you have to give away a little bit of value, don't give away all the value of your company, but if you have to give a little bit away, try and look at JVs or look at brands that maybe you could manage and add and expand your base, but maybe give them some equity so they have skin in the game. Because I think that's kind of always lacking in the sense that, the owners always want the operator to have some vested interest. I think here's a time where there might be some operators, I wouldn't say the big international ones, I don't think they're going to look at that. But I mean, branding, you've got to look at your markets. You've got to see whether they can add value in terms of that and whether it's worth. I think in a lot of markets there is value, but I think Mauritius is a different destination. I think others have tried to bring in other brands thinking that they're going to open up certain markets, and I think some have been successful, others not successful. So I think you've got to look internally at your businesses now and see what works for you and what you can consolidate. But it's all about, I wouldn't make any rash decisions because I think, we just need to look at the next few months and see what happens. But try and plan for the long term, but hope for the best.
Absolutely. Planning for the worst and hoping for the best, planning for the long term. Yep. Great to have you, Wayne. Keep well and all the best in Cape Town. Hope to see you soon, face to face, whatever that is, Mauritius, South Africa, or elsewhere in Africa. Fantastic, Wayne. Great presentation, and also your answers as well. Obviously, the knowledge that you've got, I have to remind my audience here, you're one of the very few who've got intrinsic deep knowledge of the continent. So I even think that you could easily sleep talk about hospitality in Africa, including Mauritius. Thanks a lot, Wayne, and keep well. And everybody else, thanks for watching.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks. Thank you. And you've always been a good friend, and thank you for those kind words. Thanks for the opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.